Study Section 2. Setting of Foreign Policy. Introduction. Foreign policy is not formulated and implemented in a vacuum. It is conducted within a setting or an environment which shapes it and conditions its outcome. Foreign policies are products of their environment. This study session examines the dynamic interaction between foreign policy and its environment. We shall consider the various elements of the environment or setting of foreign policy and how they interact to influence foreign policy outcomes in this study section. Setting of foreign policy. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Point out the various elements of foreign policy environment. No matter how well articulated a foreign policy might be, if the instrument is not effective enough, its goals and objectives may not be realized. This draws our attention to the importance of understanding the instruments of foreign policy. There are various types of instruments, namely diplomacy, settings of foreign policy. The setting of foreign policy refers to the global, domestic, and psychological context or environment within which a foreign policy is made and implemented. Settings here could refer to environment, whereas the domestic environment has immediate impact in determining the character, orientation, and objectives of a nation's foreign policy. The external environment provides the stimuli for policy formulation apart from being the target of policy outputs. Without the international environment, there would be no motivation or even need for foreign policy. This is not to suggest that the external environment is more compelling than the domestic environment. The division is mainly for analytical purposes because there is a dynamic interaction between elements of these environments. All the three environments impact on policy decision-making and output. It is made up of geographic, political, economic, technological, cultural, ideological, religious, and human cognitive factors that provide context within which the foreign policy of a country is made and implemented. Foreign policy analysis is concerned with interactions between the various elements of the environment and how those interactions affect state behavior. Foreign policies of countries are usually shaped and conditioned by an unsteady balance or equilibrium between the elements of the external, internal, and psychological environments within which foreign policy makers and administrators operate. The environment offers both opportunities and threats to the foreign policy makers and administrators. Foreign policy outcomes are not a monopoly of national governments. They are subject to the vagaries of structures and processes within the environment. The external environment. The external environment includes the prevailing political, economic, and social conditions in the international system, as well as those actors operating from outside the territorial boundaries of the country. The external environment of a country's foreign policy may be used to describe the country's neighbors who may be geographic, economic, political, or socio-cultural neighbors. Nigeria's geographic neighbors are those countries that are physically contiguous to Nigeria. Nigeria recognizes African countries as our geographic neighbors by virtue of Nigeria's location in the African continent. As a result, Nigeria, since after the Civil War, has always emphasized Africa as the centerpiece of our foreign policy. Nigeria's economic neighbors include the country's development partners, foreign investors, international donors and creditors, as well as multinational companies MNCs operating in the country. The country's political neighbors are those state and non-state actors that have political affiliations with the country. The United States of America, by virtue of her position and role as a superpower, may be said to be a political neighbor of all countries of the world. Nigeria's political neighbors are not just countries that have friendly diplomatic relations with Nigeria. They also include those great powers that can react significantly when Nigerians' foreign policy or behavior affect their interests or their strong allies. Nigeria's socio-cultural neighbors include all those countries that are involved in cultural exchanges with Nigeria. They may include African countries, the Commonwealth countries, Anglophone countries, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Nigeria's external environment also includes all the international organizations like the United Nations, the African Union, ECOWAS, OPEC, etc., to which the country is a member, international laws and conventions of which Nigeria is signatory. The external environment is an important factor in foreign policy making and analysis because it provides the immediate reasons and stimuli for policies, and because most of the policies are intended for its consumption. Every rational foreign policy maker tries as much as possible to put its external environment into proper consideration unless that policy is intended to bring about fundamental changes in the status quo. The external environment is important in foreign policy analysis. 1. Because it is the primary destination of all policy outputs. 2. It provides the greater proportion of the stimuli to which foreign policy decisions are responded. Domestic environment. This includes the geographical location of the state, the geographical peculiarity of the state, whether it is landlocked or is by the sea, the country's endowment of natural and human resources, the nature of the political system, the nature and quality of the population, the structure of society, the nature of the interaction among groups in the society, and the quality of its leadership, amongst others. These various factors intrude by various degrees of potency into the decision-making process, either by limiting the possibilities of action or enhancing the state's ability to respond to the external environment. A geographically isolated country, or one which is landlocked, is more likely to be hamstrung or limited in its foreign policy choice than one which has alternative outlets for its products. In the same way, a country that is endowed with abundant natural resources will more often than not have greater freedom of action in the foreign policy arena than one which is dependent on external sources for its raw material needs. What is therefore gained in terms of possibility of rationality is lost in the complicated process of decision-making and the complexity of constraints on decision-makers. The quality of leadership is also an important element in the domestic environment. Another important element in the policy process is the quality and nature of the population. In a state with a high level of literacy and functional specialization, the demands are bound to be greater simply because of the logic of awareness and needs. The understanding of policy issues is derived from the ability to understand the complexities of the internal environment constitute further constraints on the freedom of the decision maker to maneuver. This is also true of the nature of the society, whether there is gross consensus on ideology and moral values and orientation, or whether the leadership is divided by conflicting loyalties. Homogeneous societies provide opportunities for decision makers to identify more quickly the demands, needs, and aspirations of the people as distinct from heterogeneous ones in which there is often a conflict of perception. This complicates the process of command identification and consequently of policy choices. Another critical element of the domestic environment is the characteristic and quality of the press and the mass media. Where the press for the most part is privately owned and managed, there is inevitably a greater opportunity for participation in the decision-making process. The mass media in such settings are often more liberal in the opportunities which they have to express not only their opinion but also their policy preferences. This, of course, is not true of a situation in which the media is overwhelmingly owned and managed by the state or where the private media constitute an insignificant minority. In this latter situation, the opportunity for the mass media is to be an important input into the policy process. Elements of the domestic power resources include the country's level of technological development, military capability, level of economic development, the country's international political pedigree and image, as well as visionary leadership. The biggest challenge of operators of Nigeria's foreign policy appears to be how to rise above the battered image of Nigeria, resulting from many years of military dictatorship, human rights abuse, corruption, and bad governance. Psychological environment. These factors include the prevalent ideology of society, the educational orientation of the decision makers, the communal or other interest of the decision makers, the perception of the decision makers of the role of the state, etc. Both environments are important for the success of policies. In other words, it is important to understand and to correlate reality with interpretation in order to attain the objective of policies. The psychological or perceptual environment is the environment as seen by decision maker, where there is great disparity between the operational and psychological environment. Policies are more likely than not to fail. For policies to succeed, therefore, decision makers must attempt to correlate the psychological environment with the operational environment. Importance of psychological environment. The importance of the psychological environment cannot be overemphasized given the following reasons. In the first place, most societies are held together by subjective factors such as ideology, moral values, religion, etc. These are factors which no organizational complexity can eradicate. Secondly, ideology, religion, moral value tend to serve as norms for the decision maker and therefore determine the limits of their freedom as well as the options available to them. The psychological environment of foreign policy is very important because the greater and most important conflicts in the world are based on such subjective or non-rational factors such as ideologies, religious doctrines, manifestos, programs, moral values, cultural differences, racial differentiation, education, commercial interest, etc. All these elements go into creating for most states a perception of their role in the international systems as well as constituting the element of the concept of national interest. The decision maker not only has to understand the external environment through his own images and orientation, he is also compelled to understand, predict, and imagine the psychology of the countries to which his policies are aimed. This is if policies are to be relevant, implementable, or capable of attaining the goals, objectives for which they are intended. It can therefore be argued that if the national interest is a subjective concept, policies which promote such concepts are bound to be the product of non-rational or subjective factors. The psychological environment also embraces the personal traits, idiosyncrasies, and orientations of individuals acting as leaders in the state. It is often said that the course of history is determined by leaders. At the top of the bureaucracy and apparatuses of the state sit leaders who are in charge of decision-making and policy formulation. Leaders and the type of leadership they exert shape the way foreign policies go and the consequent behavior of the state they lead in world politics. Foreign policies and state actions are products of preferences and choices of strong-willed leaders acting on their own personal convictions, though leaders may be constrained by domestic and external forces which are beyond their control and therefore leaves them with little or no choice in policy options. Constraints can also be misinterpreted by the leaders. Moreover, leaders are not prisoners of constraints, and indeed, while some leaders successfully manipulate constraints to their advantage, others fail in the attempt. In the face of difficult, complex, and uncertain situations, the characteristics of leaders can have profound implications for the decisions they make. Greenstein, 1969, Herman, 1976. In such situations, what a leader believes, his operational code, how he processes information, his image and leadership style become very important factors. Cabo and Ray, 2011, page 170. The major elements of the psychological environment are ideology, religions, role perception, foreign orientation, perceptual framework, those subjective elements which operate in the mind of the decision maker. In this study section, we examine the environment within which foreign policy objectives are set, options are chosen, strategies designed, and goals pursued. We identify global, domestic, and psychological environment and the dynamic interaction between foreign policy and its environment and among the elements of the various environments, while the internal and external environment serve as the operational setting. The psychological environment provides the policymaker the perceptual frame with which he relates with the other two environments. This is the end of study section 2. Thanks for listening.